Imagine a palace so vast even silence echoes with power. Inside, beneath ceilings lined with gold and oil-lit shadows, a boy walks beside the Emperor of Rome, his face pale, his steps rehearsed. Draped in silk and pearls, he is greeted not as a servant or son, but as a wife. Guests bow. Courtiers whisper. But none dare speak the truth. This radiant empress was once a child named Livius, hand-picked and broken to replace the woman Nero murdered with his own hands. This is not a story of love. It is a story of ownership, of grief twisted into madness, and obsession sculpted into flesh. The boy did not choose his fate. He was chosen, altered, renamed, and remade, all to satisfy a man who believed he could reverse death by reshaping the living. What happened behind those palace doors wasn't just abuse. It was ritual, transformation. A tragedy so personal, so precise, it left no scars on the skin, but carved wounds no mirror could ever heal. And it all began with a single glance and a dangerous resemblance. History rarely records the whispers. It echoes with the names of conquerors, emperors, and wars, but the quiet tragedies, the stolen identities, the lives turned into theater, those are harder to find. This is not merely a tale of ancient Rome or an eccentric ruler. It's a story that peels back the velvet curtain of power and reveals the cost paid by the powerless. Livius was not born into horror. He was born into silence, a servant boy within palace walls, one of many whose names history rarely bothers to remember. Until one day he was noticed, not for something he said or something he did, but simply for the way he looked. A resemblance. A shadow. A ghost of someone the emperor could not let go. What followed was not an affair. It was not romance. It was ritualized grief masked as ceremony, madness stitched into protocol. Livius was transformed not through love, but through imperial command, remade to embody a dead woman, down to the gestures, the voice, the smile. This story isn't about gender, scandal, or Roman politics. It's about what happens when mourning meets unchecked authority. When the pain of loss is so deep, it seeks resurrection, not through memory, but through mutilation. If you think this is just history, think again. Because behind every gilded throne lies a graveyard of those sacrificed to sustain it. And one of those graves belonged to a boy who was never allowed to be himself again. Before he became a symbol, before his name was erased, Livius was simply a boy. A quiet, observant child born to a house servant in one of Rome's lesser noble families. His early years were lived in the shadows, polishing marble, fetching water, learning when to speak and when to disappear. Life in the imperial household was rigid, but not cruel, not at first. Livius was taught to read early, not because anyone believed he'd rise above his class, but because literate servants were easier to manage. He could transcribe letters, copy inventories, whisper poetry to noble children while they drifted to sleep. He was graceful, quiet, obedient, exactly the kind of boy who survived unnoticed. But within those palace walls, no one was ever truly safe. Rome, under Emperor Nero, was a place of paradox. On the surface, it glittered, fountains flowing with wine, theaters packed with spectacle, parades of color and sound to distract from the growing cracks beneath. Nero, once hailed as the golden boy of Rome, had grown erratic. His decisions no longer followed logic, only whim. And whim, in a palace like his, was law. For Livius, the first sign of danger was subtle. He began to feel eyes on him, lingering, assessing, as if he were being measured for a role he hadn't auditioned for. It wasn't affection. It was curiosity. And from the palace whispers, he pieced together a single truth. The emperor was grieving. Her name had once hung on everyone's lips. Valeria, the Empress of Rome. She had been beautiful, yes, but also clever, influential, and deeply adored by Nero. until the day she died in the emperor's own chambers after an argument no one dared speak of openly. Some said she fell. Others said she was struck. What was known, however, was that Nero changed after that night. He stopped attending the Senate. He stopped performing in public. He spent hours alone, staring at portraits, and when he did emerge, his eyes swept the halls like a man searching for something already lost. That was when Livius was summoned. No explanation, no warning. One moment he was folding linens, and the next he stood in a vaulted room lined with torches, facing the emperor himself. Nero did not speak right away. He only stared. His gaze drifted over Livius' face, cheekbones, jawline, eyes lingering with a strange hunger. Then, almost absent-mindedly, he whispered, "It's as if the gods returned her to me." Livius didn't understand. Not fully. But something ancient in his bones told him this was not admiration. This was selection. Tutors were assigned to teach him music, diction, the movements of courtly life. Other servants began treating him differently, not with kindness, but with the brittle politeness reserved for things too sacred or too cursed to be touched. Each morning brought new instructions. Speak softer, walk slower, tilt your head when you listen, smile, but only slightly. There were no explanations, only expectations. And somewhere deep inside, Livius began to vanish, not physically, not yet, but emotionally. He no longer laughed. He no longer hummed when he worked. He watched himself becoming something he didn't recognize, and still he obeyed. Because in Rome, under Nero, disobedience was not corrected. It was erased. The transformation began not with blood, but with silk. After his summons to Nero's chambers, Livius was given a new set of quarters lavishly furnished far from the servant halls. There were no windows. The walls were lined with tapestries embroidered in gold, and the scent of myrrh clung to every surface. A silver mirror stood in the corner, taller than him, polished to perfection. It would become his silent witness. He was no longer addressed as Livius by the palace staff. They called him Little One, Dear, or simply avoided his name altogether. It was as if the very sound of who he had been was being erased, syllable by syllable. His meals changed. He was no longer fed with the other boys, but dined alone, served sweet wines and delicate fruits he hadn't even known existed. At first, he was flattered. Then he realized this wasn't kindness. It was conditioning. Nero began visiting his chambers unannounced. Sometimes he'd bring musicians and watch Livius listen as if testing his reactions. Sometimes he'd sit silently, eyes scanning the boy's face like a sculptor studying raw marble. He rarely touched him, but the absence of violence only made the tension worse. Every moment was a performance. Then came the dress. It arrived folded in a velvet-lined chest, deep blue, trimmed in pearls. No explanation accompanied it, just a nod from the attendant who laid it on the bed and left. Livius stared at it for hours. When he finally put it on, his hands trembled. The fabric was soft, but it felt like chains. When Nero saw him, he smiled for the first time in weeks. "Yes," he murmured, almost to himself, "yes, there you are." The days blurred after that. Livius was forbidden to cut his hair. Stylists were brought in to curl and bind it in elaborate patterns. He was taught how to sit with folded hands, how to pour wine with grace, how to keep his eyes down, but his posture straight. Each lesson was laced with a silent warning: resist and disappear. It wasn't just about appearance. Nero began referring to him as Valeria, not in private, but in court, before senators, dignitaries, generals, and no one dared to correct him. One evening, during a banquet, Nero placed a sapphire necklace around Livius's neck, a piece once worn by the real empress. He then raised a goblet and toasted, "To my beloved, returned to me by the will of the gods." The room fell into rehearsed applause, but Livius felt the weight of 1,000 eyes pressing into him, searching for the boy behind the costume and finding nothing. Behind closed doors, Nero spoke to him of memories that weren't his. "Do you remember our time in Alexandria?" he'd ask, recounting scenes from his life with Valeria. Livius was expected to nod, smile, play the part. He memorized those stories like lines from a tragic play, rehearsing responses in the mirror so he wouldn't falter. Any mistake, any pause, was met with cold silence, followed by days of absence. Worse than Nero's presence was his withdrawal. In those silences, Livius questioned reality. Was he still Livius? Or had that name been buried with the old linens he no longer touched? The mirror offered no answers, only a reflection he no longer recognized. One night during a storm, Nero arrived at his chamber, soaking wet, eyes wild. Without a word, he collapsed to the floor and clutched Livius's robe, whispering Valeria's name like a prayer. "Don't leave me again," he repeated over and over, shaking. Livius stood frozen, unsure whether to console him or run. In that moment, he realized the terrifying truth. Nero didn't see him as a boy. He didn't see him as anyone. He saw a ghost. And ghosts weren't allowed to have choices. From that night on, the palace doors were always locked from the outside. There was no ceremony for what came next, no announcement, no decree. He simply nodded, bowed, and waited, though every breath felt like a countdown. He had heard whispers of procedures performed in the palace, strange, sacred, unspeakable things done in the name of beauty, loyalty, or punishment. But nothing had prepared him for what the emperor intended. At sunrise, 4 men in white entered his chamber. Their faces were calm, clinical. Their hands carried blades. The surgery was performed not in a hospital, but in a private wing of the palace, where walls were muffled and no screams could carry. Livius was held down by guards while the physicians worked, chanting softly in Latin, as though prayer could cleanse the horror of what they did. No anesthesia, no comfort, just hands, steel, and silence. He did not die. When he awoke, he couldn't scream. His throat was too dry. His body burned with a pain so deep it felt separate from him, like it belonged to someone else. The attendants told him it had been successful. They offered him wine and smiled too gently. From that day forward, the mirror no longer showed a boy. It showed something else, softened, reshaped, carved like a statue no one asked to be. He was dressed again in silk. His hair was styled higher. Rouge colored his cheeks, and his lips were tinted with crushed berries. He was given rings for his fingers, anklets for his feet, and earrings that once belonged to the dead empress. When Nero visited, he called him "My Valeria" and wept with joy. "The gods have blessed me," he whispered. "She has returned to me." Livius said nothing. He smiled as he had been taught. The transformation was not just physical. It was behavioral. A team of tutors drilled him daily how to walk with grace, how to hold a fan, how to incline his head in acknowledgement without appearing bold. He was forbidden to speak in low tones. Voice coaches worked tirelessly to lift his register, training him to sound delicate, breathy, divine. Each movement was monitored, each gesture corrected. If he raised his voice, if he stepped too heavily, if he forgot to smile at the right time, he was made to start over. Perfection was not optional. It was demanded, because Nero didn't just want a woman, he wanted a memory, living and breathing. The wedding was held 3 months later. It was a spectacle of impossible grandeur. The palace was transformed into a temple. Musicians played melodies composed by Nero himself. Flowers were flown in from distant provinces. Livius, now renamed Sabina, was carried down the aisle in a gilded litter, surrounded by priestesses who chanted praises to Venus. Before hundreds of Rome's most powerful men, they exchanged vows. Nero placed a ring on Sabina's finger. A legal document was signed. It was, by Roman law, a marriage. The guests clapped, bowed, and smiled. No one dared speak of what they had just witnessed. After the ceremony, Sabina was taken to new quarters, larger, more ornate, with statues of the former empress lining the hall. Each day she walked past the same faces carved in marble, knowing she was meant to become them. She was expected to accompany Nero to public events, to sit beside him at banquets, to whisper praise when he performed on stage. Always dressed, always composed, always grateful. The horror was not in violence, it was in repetition, in performance, in the requirement to inhabit someone else's soul so completely that your own began to rot. There were moments when Sabina caught glimpses of herself barefoot in the moonlight, standing before the mirror, wondering if her voice was still her own. She tried once to write a letter just to see if her hand remembered her original name, but the ink trembled and her hand froze. She could not finish it, because who would she send it to? Who even remembered who she had been? Nero, in private, treated her like a relic. He spoke endlessly of memories that were not hers, forcing her to respond as if they were. "Remember the garden in spring?" he'd say. "You wore the lilac dress." She would nod, smile, lie. Because if she didn't, he would disappear for days, and when he returned, his rage would be colder than silence. She once tried to speak plainly to remind him she was not Valeria. He silenced her with a kiss and whisper, "You are now." The rest was just a dream. And in that moment, she believed him, because dreams are supposed to end. But this one never did. By the winter of 67 AD, the empire had begun to fracture, quietly at first, then violently. Rebellions brewed in distant provinces. Senators whispered treason behind silk curtains. Generals gritted their teeth at Nero's absence from the battlefield while his focus remained fixed on music, poetry, and the ghost he had fashioned into a bride. But within the palace, Sabina continued her performance. She walked with practiced grace, bowed when spoken to, smiled when praised. She knew the rhythms of survival. She had learned to become air, visible, beautiful, but untouchable. Yet inside, something had begun to crack. The mirrors no longer shocked her, but neither did they comfort. She no longer searched for herself in them. She no longer expected to find anything. Nero's behavior grew more erratic. He staged operas where Sabina was expected to sit, front row, dressed in white, applauding on cue. He paraded her through festivals as a divine figure. Once, in a moment of euphoria, he demanded that temples be built in her honor. The Senate obeyed, stone by stone, out of fear, not devotion. When Rome burned, Nero wept for his lost city. But privately, he wept more for Valeria, the real one, long dead and unresurrected, no matter how closely Sabina mimicked her smile. The illusion had limits, and madness doesn't cope well with limits. By 68 AD, everything fell apart. The Praetorian Guard, once Nero's fiercest protectors, turned against him. Governors declared him an enemy of the state. The Senate issued a warrant for his arrest. Nero fled the city in disguise, accompanied by a few loyalists, Sabina among them. They hid in a decaying villa on the outskirts of Rome. The halls were moldy, the furniture overturned, but Nero still carried his harp. At night, he would play and speak of their return, of triumph, of rebuilding. Sabina listened in silence, wrapped in a robe too large for her frail frame. Her eyes, once wide with fear, now stared flat and glassy, like marble polished too thin. Then came the final day. A messenger arrived. The Senate had declared Nero a public enemy. His life was forfeit. The emperor panicked, raving about fleeing to Egypt, about staging a final performance in Athens. Then, abruptly, he demanded a dagger. None of his men offered one. Only Sabina remained still. That night, Nero ended his life, clumsy, bloody, alone. The world moved on. Rome crowned new emperors. Statues fell. Temples were rededicated. But for Sabina, the nightmare did not end with Nero's death. She was not freed, she was transferred. The new regime considered her both a relic and a threat, a living symbol of the madness they'd just overthrown. But the mirrors were always the same, and in each she saw not a woman, not a man, not even a person, just an echo. Her final days were lived in silence. She spoke little, laughed never, and no longer looked people in the eyes. Her steps were small, careful, forgotten. Until one day, the new emperor announced a festival, a public reenactment of Roman myths in the Colosseum. He had selected Sabina to play the victim in a performance of Persephone's descent into the underworld. The script was clear: humiliation, spectacle, mockery. Before thousands, she accepted without protest. But that night, she drank a small vial of poison. No one knows where she obtained it. No one asked. By dawn, she was gone, alone in her chamber, wrapped in a white robe, her hands folded across her chest as if in prayer. She was 20 years old. In choosing death, she chose the only thing that had ever been truly hers, the right to end it. It was a final act of rebellion, a whisper of defiance from the ashes of a stolen self. History barely remembers her real name. But in that final silence, Sabina was no longer an empress, no longer a ghost, no longer an illusion for a madman's comfort. She was herself, and that finally was enough.